Well, good morning. I want to welcome you to Tuesday morning's edition of Just My Two Cents Really. And we haven't been together since last week, so thank you for joining me. I wanted to explain the fact that we answer questions here on this broadcast. Most of you know that if you've been on the broadcast before, but we're answering questions that nobody's asking. And I'm just kidding. I'm wondering if you're listening here this morning. We are asking questions that a lot of people have asked over the years to me, and I've asked these questions and recent questions. And today's an important question too, because it's something that we all deal with. Sometimes the questions aren't as weighty to other people as they might be to you, and that's understandable. We're all different parts of our lives, different tracks that we're running on. But today is a universal track, and I want to speak on grief. I want to speak on grief today, and I want to answer the question, how do I get through the grief and pain of losing someone I loved? So, how do we get through it? How do we deal with it? How do we manage it? We're going to get back to that word later on in our broadcast at the end. But keep in mind that grief is experience of loss, right? We can have grief. A lot of times we think grief is just losing somebody in death, but grief can be losing somebody in a friendship, in a marriage, in a, losing a child that doesn't want to bother with you anymore as a parent. Losing a job is grief, right? Losing your wealth is grief. And so grief comes in all different packages. So how do we resolve grief? And I think a lot of times people are walking around, they look happy, they look normal, they have a job, they're not falling apart, they're providing for their family, they're going to church, and we think that these people have it together. But very often there's a grief running through us, all of us, that maybe nobody knows about, or maybe we haven't dealt with it, or maybe we're drowning in that grief and loss, and we don't even know it. And so I want to share with you some thoughts that this morning. They're not the 10 Commandments here, but there's some thoughts that I come up with to help people through grief and pain. And here's what I want to say as I begin. You have never really lost something if you know where it is. Okay? You've never really lost something if you know where it is. One reason that we often find grief such a difficult challenge is that we have never learned what to expect in grief, right? Let me share with you some thoughts about grief and how we can successfully work through the process of loss and grief and pain, of separation, and find considerable healing. The first thing I want to say is this: grief is absolutely normal for everyone. Okay? Grief is normal. Grief is not a disease. It is a normal human response to a significant loss, right? When you lose someone special from your life, you're going to grieve. Our grief is saying that we miss the person and that we're struggling to adjust to a life without that special relationship. Admittedly, saying that grief is normal does not minimize its difficulty. And I think that's important to understand, right? And so grief is absolutely normal for everyone. You don't have a disease, you're not strange, you're not abnormal. You're normal because grief visits all of us on a daily basis and on a weekly basis. Okay? So that's the first thing. Number one. Number two, the worst kind of grief is yours. The worst kind of grief is yours. A loss is a very personal matter, isn't it? Your loss seems like the worst possible thing that could have happened to you. The worst kind of loss is yours. When you lose a significant person in your life, whatever the relationship is, it hurts. And nothing takes away from your right to feel the loss and grief the absence of that person is from your life. The worst kind of grief is yours. Now, some of us are very good with other people when they're going through grief, and that's great, but it's not like our own grief. And so Grief is absolutely normal, and the worst kind of grief is ours. Thirdly, the way out of grief is through it. Now, we don't like this one, right? We wish it would go away. We wish it would just vanish, right? And yet, the way out of grief is to go through it. I like what I think it was Winston Churchill who said, "If you're going through hell, keep going." I like that, right? Don't stop, right? The way out of grief is to go through it. Grief is painful. Loss is one of the most difficult human experiences. There's no easy way around it. We try to avoid the pain. We may attempt to get over it as quickly as possible, but most often it simply does not work that way. The way out of grief and its pain is to courageously go through it. Now, we can do a lot of things to not go through it, right? We can go around it. We can deny it. We can substance it, right? We can go another route to try to circumvent the pain and the grief and the loss and the tears, right? But the only way out of grief is to go through it. Now, I wish there was another way, and so do you, but there isn't. And so the worst kind of grief is yours. The way out of grief is through it. And then your grief is intimately connected to the relationship you had, right? Every relationship holds a special and unique significance to us. To fully interpret our grief response, we need to understand what the relationship brought to our lives, and therefore what has been lost from our lives. That's important. We each grieve differently, and each loss is grief in a whole different way. There's no measurement. Listen now, there's no measurement or formula for individual grief. None. See, your grief is intimately connected to the relationship you have, and that's why grief is different for every person, right? When you're not close to someone and they die, or you lose them in a relationship or whatever else, and you're not as soul tied to them, well, then there's not a great, tremendous amount of weighty grief on us. But boy, if you're really tied and tethered to that person, it's heavy, isn't it? And so your grief is intimately connected to the relationship that you had with them. And I want you to understand that, because sometimes we think that we're not grieving enough for a certain person. We're not grieving enough for a certain situation. And it's all tied to the connection, right? It's all tied to the connection. Sometimes we learn where our connection was, whether it was strong or weak, based on our response in grief. And so it's a learning process for us. And then grief is hard work. Grief is hard work, isn't it? Grief requires more energy to work through than most people expect. It takes a toll on us physically and emotionally. And though we must learn to manage our grief, we must never buy into the false belief that grief is ever over fully for those we've lost, right? It's a hard and a long journey towards wholeness. I'm going to touch on that at the end as well. So I'm going to move right on, and we'll come back to that. But grief is hard work. And then your grief, you need to know, will take longer than you and others think. This is an important one, because I think we forget this. How long will grief last? Do we have an answer for that? Here's the answer, and I really believe this is the answer. It is finished when it's finished. It is finished when it's finished. Every birthday, holiday, and memory remind us of our loss, all our difficult days, and we need to anticipate them and know they're normal and be compassionate with ourselves. Did you hear that? Be compassionate with yourself. Take your time. There's no time clock on you, only that which you allow other people to put on you or you put on yourself. There's no time clock. Listen, he who has no time to mourn has no time to mend. Grief always takes longer than people expect, and even you expect. Isn't that the truth? And it's okay. Listen now, I can't underestimate this statement anymore. And it's this: the goal is to grow in our grief, not speed through it. Listen, your grief will take longer than you and others think, and it's okay. And then grief is unpredictable. It is. Some of your responses after your loss may seem quite uncharacteristic to you. You might think, this isn't like me to act this way or to speak this way or to respond this way. Well, grief is unpredictable. Say that with me. Grief is unpredictable. Say it one more time. Grief is unpredictable. Turn to the person next to you, and if it's a dog, that's okay. Grief is unpredictable. Say that to them. See, we cannot present the journey of grief in a neat, predictable package. Just when you think you figured it out, something comes along to surprise you. And here it is. The one predictable thing about grief is, you ready? That it's unpredictable. The one predictable thing about grief is it's unpredictable. And then grief comes and goes, doesn't it? We have said that grief is not a disease. If you have a sore throat, it's painful for a few days, then the pain easily eases off and it goes away, right? It disappears. Grief doesn't work that way, though, does it? Our healing process is different from a sickness model. Grief is indeed like a roller coaster. Many have not learned that grief comes and goes and takes much longer than most people expect. And we need to realize this if we're going to work our way through grief, if grief is going to work itself out. And we need to trust that process. As difficult as it is, it helps us move towards reconciliation and proper management of grief. We need to understand that grief is going to come and go. You know, you'll be sitting there and all of a sudden you'll be hit with grief. Like where did that come from? But that's the way grief is. Grief is an ever active, moving thing in our subconscious and our conscience. And we don't know when it's going to hit us and when it's not. And it's not something to be afraid of, but it's something to understand and be ready for. And then lastly, effective grief work is not done alone. And I saved this one for last because I think maybe it's the most important. Most people don't understand what is normal in grief. And people expect us to get over it quickly, don't they? They express these expectations in a way that seem to be really insensitive. Many people mistakenly believe that grief is so personal that we need to keep it to ourselves, right? We say grieving people don't talk. Well, grieving people need to talk. Now, not everyone will be willing or even able to respond to you. In fairness, not everyone can. And I think that's important to understand. Not every, when I was going through a particular situation not long ago, a grief situation, I thought to myself one day, where are all the people that know me and love me? Like they're absent in this season of my life. Where are they? But, some people just don't know what to say. They don't know how to respond to you. And it's not a lack of love. It's not a lack of interest. It's not a lack of friendship. In fairness, some people just can't. And so we need to be easy on them, right? I believe in the power of shared experience, and often others who have been through the deep places that we've been through, how much they can be a help to us. Listen, effective grief work is not done alone. You need people. You need to share your grief with people. If you're struggling tremendously with grief and it's burying you and it's drowning you, you need to talk to somebody. Maybe it's a counselor. Maybe it's a therapist. Maybe it's a psychologist. Maybe it's a pastor. Or maybe it's a good friend. Who knows who it is? But effective grief work is never, listen to me, did I say never? Never done alone. And so it's important to understand that we cannot be an island when we're trying to process grief. The home of Paul Laurence Dunbar, noted poet, is open to the public in Dayton, Ohio. You can go to it. When Dunbar died, his mother left his room exactly as it was on the day of his death. At the desk of this brilliant man was his final poem, handwritten on a pad. After his mother died, her friends discovered that Paul Laurence Dunbar's last poem had been lost forever. Why? Because his mother had made his room into a shrine and never had moved anything. And the son had bleached the ink in which the poem was written until it was invisible. The poem was gone. What's the moral of the story? If we stay in mourning, we'll lose so much of life. And that's important to understand. Listen, I want to talk for a moment as I close on this idea of managing grief versus moving out of grief, right? Because there's a lot of misunderstandings about this. But the truth of the matter is, when we lose something, we never get over it. We've said that to people. I've said that to people. People have said that to me. We need to snap out of it and we need to get over it and we need to, get on with it, right? And the truth of the matter is that that's not possible. But we can and we must manage it. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that we can learn to live with our pain by managing it. We can't get rid of it. We can't act like we've gotten rid of it. We can't be in denial that we've gotten rid of it, because when we lose someone we love in a relationship or through death, or we lose something that we put our heart and soul into, it's always going to be with us. Always. And it's okay. It's okay. You're always going to love, right? Somebody was asking me not long ago, and they were saying, I miss my first husband, and the person I'm married to now, I love too, but I still have a love for my first husband. What, am I wrong? Am I evil? No. Now, if the first husband's still alive, certainly you have to learn to manage the fact that you're not married anymore to that person. But if they've died, it's a little bit different, isn't it? See, that love stays with us, but we can love again, right? We can love again. We can love differently. And so the whole secret of grief is learning to manage it. Listen, it's not the bad memories that destroy us and paralyze us. It's the pain of those memories. And so what do we need to do? We need to manage the pain. That doesn't mean we go on pills or that's not the way I'm talking about managing. I'm talking about learning to live with it, learning to function with it, learning to embrace it, even though you don't like it. See? And so I want to encourage you in Jesus' name today that if you're struggling with grief, maybe something happened 20 years ago and you're still paralyzed. God doesn't want that. God wants something more for you. And it's not getting over it. It's not moving out of grief, but it's learning to manage it. And so maybe you need somebody who can help you do that. And so you need to reach out to somebody to help you walk through so you can learn to manage the grief and find life again. Well, I hope this was a blessing to you. I hope it was a challenge and encouragement to you. Just some thoughts about how we manage and learn to live with grief and loss and pain. And so I want to encourage you in Jesus' name to walk with the King and be a blessing today. Share this with somebody. Maybe, really you can share it with anybody, because we're all going through grief at one time or another, and we're going to go through grief and pain and loss. And we need to know some of the parameters that we need to place in our own lives so we can be healthy, emotional, and spiritual human beings. Well, God bless you on this Tuesday. Serve the Lord, and Lord willing, we'll see you again tomorrow.